She is the reigning Teacher of the Year in her school district, seemingly the kind of person you would want in the classroom with your kindergartner. But now this kindergarten teacher could be in big trouble for an unthinkable crime. She is accused of sexual abuse of a minor. We have some of the details on it. We're on the case, presented by Law & Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. We do so many of these stories, and it can feel like they're stories that are just happening more and more. Teachers who are entrusted with raising our children, accused of crossing the line with people who are underage. Here's the latest case we're following. It involves an elementary school teacher by the name of Heather Ozment. She taught kindergarten in the small town of Calera, Alabama, a community south of Birmingham. It's been booming in population over the last few decades. According to the 2020 census, it's now home to more than 16,000 people. It's one of the fastest growing cities in that state, and it's a place that has attracted a lot of families. According to niche.com, which is a website that helps families find school systems where they fit best, Calera got an A when it came to being good for families. And at the local public school, Calera Elementary, home of the Eagles, there was no better teacher in 2024 and 2025 than Mrs. Ozment, the kindergarten teacher. Here's the Facebook post in September of last year from the school district saying, quote, "Congratulations to our 2024-2025 Teacher of the Year, Mrs. Heather Ozment." And you can see the big smile on Heather's face as she holds a bouquet of flowers. Now, this is what you'll see if you try to click on the link to get to that post on social media. We tried here on Instagram, and you can see she's apparently been wiped from the school's social media pages. We also couldn't find that post on Facebook anymore. And when I tell you what she's been accused of, you might understand why the school district would be taking those measures. Now, it's always shocking when a teacher is accused of violating a minor. But for it to be the teacher of Mrs. Ozment's caliber, the one who is the reigning Teacher of the Year at her elementary school, it is even more shocking. Little more than 6 months after Mrs. Ozment won that Teacher of the Year award, shocking allegations came forward. The district said in April they learned of what police called inappropriate conduct by a local teacher. According to WTVM-TV in Alabama, an indictment reads that on April 4th of this year, Ozment, the reigning Teacher of the Year, is accused of taking a child older than 12 years old but younger than 16 to a bathroom for sexual purposes. Now, there are still several details that have yet to come forward related to this case, but I'll tell you what we know right now and how the school district seems to be responding. The district told the TV station, quote, "Shelby County Schools was made aware of allegations concerning a teacher from the Calera school zone in early April. The teacher was immediately put on leave for the remainder of the school year while the matter was investigated by local law enforcement. The alleged conduct occurred after school hours and did not take place at a school facility. We are unable to provide more information due to it being a personnel matter." We know from police that the Owens House, which is a local child advocacy center, did forensic interviews with the alleged victims. Ozment was not arrested until this month, which is roughly 2 months after those allegations first came forward. A grand jury indicted her on counts of first-degree sexual abuse, second-degree sexual abuse, and enticing a child to enter a vehicle, house, etc., for immoral purposes. Police say the incident didn't happen on school property and it allegedly happened after school hours. The address that WTVM says the incident happened at, according to the indictment, is a local restaurant in Calera, according to what we saw on Google Maps. Police say the 2024-2025 Teacher of the Year is now on administrative leave as this legal process plays out. She was booked into the Shelby County Jail on June 6th, and court records show that she bonded out on that same day. Her bond was set at $45,000. $15,000 for each count she faced. Since her arrest, it appears that Ozment has been somewhat active on social media. Just a day ago, she updated her banner on Facebook to these crosses. Before we get back to this story out of Alabama, I want to tell you why On the Case is one of the top performing shows on YouTube, and it's because the world is unpredictable, and a lot of the stories we tell, if anything, they show why having a good attorney matters, and that's where we bring in our partners, Morgan & Morgan. This is a law firm with more than 1,000 attorneys and a history of winning. Just in the last few months, Morgan & Morgan was able to secure a $9.3 million verdict for a car crash in Florida, a $5.6 million verdict for another car accident victim in Atlanta, not to mention $1.8 million in Kentucky, and that was after insurance offered them a mere $5,000 in that case. So even if you don't think your case is worth millions of dollars, why not fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so easy to file a claim. You can do it with just 8 easy clicks on your phone. So if you've been hurt, you need to file a claim, go to www.forthepeople.com/OTC. Also, you can scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description of this video. All right, let's get back to the story. Joining us now to break down this story is criminal defense attorney Josh Corman. Thanks for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime. It's just so shocking, and we cover these cases a lot. In this case, this is a person who was recognized as Teacher of the Year. What stands out to you? And I know there's not a lot of specifics right now, but just stands out to you that someone would be accused of something like this?
I think you're right. This is one of those things that we seem to see in the news, month after month, time after time, and it kind of baffles us every time. Every time we see one of these cases, I think we all have the same thoughts. Like, we just can't imagine a teacher, especially someone like this, a very well-respected teacher, a kindergarten teacher, who's respected by her school as a Teacher of the Year, that seems to have gotten themselves in a mess like this.
Yeah, it's just tough. And again, we don't know what details will come forward, because when you're dealing with minors, you need to protect their identity and a lot of the information. She's facing, there's 3 counts she's facing, 3 charges she's facing. There's first-degree sex abuse and second-degree sex abuse. Typically, what's the difference between a first-degree and a second-degree charge here?
So this is in Alabama. So from what I understand, I guess they're both Class C felonies, which means they both carry 1 to 10 years in prison or possible imprisonment of that amount of time. I think the difference between their first degree and the second degree is whether the victim was forced. I think in both of the instances, part of the statute is the age. So between the age of 12 and 16, I think the distinction between first degree and second degree is whether there was force or coercion that was used to accomplish that. And again, so we don't know specifically what force that was used, but that could also be one of the reasons that they indicted as 2 different charges. Those are oftentimes, we refer to those as alternative legal theories. And it may be that the prosecutor kind of gives themselves 2 bites at the apple. They charge both of those counts so that if it comes out that the evidence isn't that strong, maybe for the first degree charge, they still have the second degree that would not require any type of a force because of the age difference and because of her age, and the distinction between the 2 of their ages. It still is a Class C felony, so it would end up being the same punishment either way.
And then the third charge is an enticement charge. According to a local TV station that saw the indictment, this woman's accused of bringing this person between the age of 12 and 16 into a bathroom. It appears it might have happened at a restaurant, and that's where the sexual acts took place. What type of punishment can you get for the enticement charge on top of the first and second degree abuse charges if those go through?
Sure. So it's the same Class C felony. So again, each of those in Alabama carries 1 to 10 years. Those could all run together concurrently, which means that they're at the same time, or they could get stacked up and have to do consecutive sentences if that's something that a judge decides is, I guess, would be appropriate in a case like this. But you're right, the enticement would be, and from what we understand from the little bit we have on the indictment, is that it was a restaurant. I know that was reported somewhere that it was in the bathroom of that restaurant. And that the way the statute reads is, I guess, enticing a child. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there had to be touching, but you could even, I guess, solicit or make some kind of a comment or something to propose some type of an act. That would even be enough to qualify under the statute, even if an actual physical act didn't take place.
And according to the police and the school district, the allegation of something happening came in on April 4th, and then this teacher was not arrested until June 6th. What happens typically between the moment that, and apparently she was put on leave as soon as the accusation came in, but why does it take 2 months to then get her to the point where she's being arrested?
Sure. No, I think that's a good question. And I'll be honest with you, I think 2 months is actually a pretty short amount of time in the scheme of what we normally see. But what I assume probably happened in this is once that there was an accusation made, law enforcement and children's services were contacted. And then generally, instead of law enforcement interviewing a child, they will refer the child to the child advocacy centers. And those child advocacy centers all across the country have people who are specifically trained to talk to kids. So they're trained to know how to ask questions appropriately, not ask leading questions. And those interviews themselves can be used as evidence in court. They're videotaped and they are given to the prosecutor, and ultimately they can be played in a trial. And so that is the avenue that they go about, so that a child victim does not have to be interviewed by a bunch of different people or talk to a bunch of people, and whoever it is that speaks to them is trained to know how to talk to them and do it appropriately so that it can be used in court. So it sounds like once there was some type of an accusation made and a referral was made, that's what happened in this case. And I don't know if it was one child or multiple children based on kind of the reports that we read, but that's the process that would have gone through. Now, then the next step is generally once law enforcement and a prosecutor meet to decide if there's going to be criminal charges, they could issue a warrant right away. You would arrest somebody, and then the case would start off in a lower court. Sometimes depending on the state, it may be called a general sessions court or associate circuit court or whatever it is, but that is the first level of court. At that level, normally a victim would have to come into court and testify for them to make a decision if there is probable cause to believe that a crime was committed. However, a prosecutor also has the discretion or the authority to skip that phase and just go straight to the grand jury for an indictment. And with that, you may save the child from having to come to court to testify at a lower level of court, so that the only time they may have to testify is if in fact the case ever went to a jury trial. And so generally that is something that's a very common strategy or technique to try to keep victims in child sex abuse cases out of the courtroom or having to testify multiple times.
And in this case, it went to a grand jury, and the grand jury indicted this teacher on these particular charges. I know that there's like the saying, and I've heard it before on this show, when people say, a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. Is it really that simple? I mean, what type of evidence do you have to present to a grand jury to get to the point where someone's being arrested?
Sadly, it really is that simple. It almost is a rubber stamp, especially in many jurisdictions. Now, I don't practice in this county, so I don't know exactly how they handle their grand jury hearings, but oftentimes, yes, an officer walks into the grand jury. So in a grand jury proceeding, there's no judge, sometimes there's no prosecutor, there's no defense attorney, no defendant. Someone just goes into the grand jury, present some evidence to them, and that may be as simple as they just read a probable cause statement, or said, here, read a summary of here's what the evidence is in this case, and then they already have the paperwork pre-prepared of these are the charges that we're asking you to indict on, and the foreperson of the grand jury signs off on that. Whoever's on the grand jury panel, they vote, they approve the charges, the grand jury foreperson signs off on it, and that's the end of it. And in larger jurisdictions like where I am right now, they will churn through dozens or even hundreds of those a week as they're going through a grand jury proceeding. So oftentimes there's not very much substantive evidence. There may be very, very few people actually testifying or presenting anything, and none of those witnesses are being cross-examined at all.
And in this case, the police talked about the help from a child advocacy center in Shelby County, Alabama, that do forensic interviews with young people when they are allegedly victims of crimes like this. What type of experience, how is it? And I know there's specially trained people to talk to children who have been through traumatic experiences, but in your experience in seeing these investigations and how they go about, I mean, specifically, how do they have these conversations where they're able to get the information they need and do it in a way where someone can talk about something really traumatic that they say that they've been through, and not harming the child, because they are going to have issues long-term based on what happened?
Right. So I think they are very trained. And in my experience, the forensic interviews that I have dealt with, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, are very skilled at what they do. And they're very good at, I think, of limiting the amount of information that they have so that they can go in. They kind of follow a format. There's a brief period of rapport building where they just get some basic information and hopefully are in a position where a child will open up and speak. But if they don't, then that's the end of it. They're not forcing a child. They're not trying to feed them any information. They ask very open-ended questions, just kind of the first things are usually, where do you go to school? Who do you live with? what things do you like to do? Like I said, rapport building. And then it gets into more specific, like, do you know why you're here today? Or can you tell me why you're here today? And I've seen many times with kids where they do not make a disclosure. They don't end up saying, anything that would be used in court. And that, again, that's just part of the process of, if a child does not feel comfortable and doesn't open up, then that's just part of what the interviewer does. But in those interviews, they're in a small room, usually kid friendly, and the only people in the room is the one interviewer and the child. No one else is allowed in the room. There are normally video cameras in there, so in a separate room you might have children's services or a prosecutor or a police officer watching that interview. And most of the time at the end of the interview, then they will get on the phone and say, is there anything else that you want me to follow up on, or any other questions that you have, anything we need to clarify? But that's why they, I guess, kind of follow that protocol, so that by asking those type of questions, those are things that by statute would be able to be played in front of a jury. Because you do get times with kids in court where, when it's time for a trial and you're standing up, they're in front of a bunch of strangers talking about maybe a very traumatic time. Sometimes kids will freeze up, or they won't answer questions, or they can't remember anything. And that's the reason that the law allows these forensic interviews to be played.
Does the law see, because in this case, what allegedly happened, it didn't happen on school grounds, didn't happen during school hours, and didn't happen with the particular students. She's a kindergarten teacher, so this doesn't involve kindergartners. Does the law view those details? Does that come into play at all as this plays out, that it wasn't her students on a school campus during those hours?
I think it's certainly important, and had it been someone from her school or someone that she had some type of supervisory authority over, there would probably be different charges. Oftentimes we see charges that involve, one of the elements of the crime is that there's some type of authority figure, whether that's a teacher, a coach, a counselor, a parent or babysitter, or whatever that is, scout leader, those type of things. Obviously, in this case, that was not one of the elements of it. So it sounds like the fact that it was off campus, it was not a student, and they didn't allege that, however it was that they met up, had anything to do with her position of authority as a teacher.
And I know every case is different, but we do see a lot of these cases, particularly with teachers who are accused of crimes like this teacher is accused of. In your career, if you were to sum up why this seems to happen, and someone asks you, how is it that someone who is the reigning teacher of the year then ends up being accused of something like this and crossing the line? I mean, it seems like the person you would trust to be in the classroom with your students. What have you seen common trends, related to these cases involving teachers?
That's a great question, and one that I don't have an answer for. I think I've been asked that several times, and I think we've all kind of tried to wrap our head around, how does someone who has been trained and kind of devoted their careers to working with kids and being in this, how do they put themselves in a position to have inappropriate relationships like this with students? And I honestly, I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know if social media or whatever people have going on at home in their own lives, but it's kind of baffling to us how often we see this with teachers, and with teachers having inappropriate relations like this. But it's something that you're right, we see it pops up on the news all the time. These are cases that, at least in the last 10 to 20 years, seem to be a constant thing, and I wish I had an answer for what's going on in their mind of why they're making these decisions. But to be honest with you, I don't have any idea myself.
Yeah, it's hard. It's kind of one of those chicken or the egg things, I feel like, because on one hand, we see it more because there's social media outlets like us, we cover it a lot more. So you hear about it more, but then you also wonder if it is something that's happening more often. Based on the charges that this teacher is facing, what type of punishment would you expect her to receive if she's guilty of what she's being accused of?
Right. So obviously the charges carry somewhere between 1 and 10 years. Now, a prosecutor has, a lot of discretion of how they will end up disposing of this case. So this doesn't necessarily mean that this case will go to trial. This very well could be something that is negotiated, and some kind of police settlement gets worked out. I think one of the things that anytime you have a sex charge like this, you also have collateral consequences that are going to go along with it. So whether she got probation or had to serve prison time, whatever that amount of time is, you also are going to have the issue of being on the sex offender registry. And you can also have an issue of being on a registry where you could no longer work with kids. And I would imagine that that's going to be something that would almost be an automatic consequence in the negotiations, is that she would have to surrender her license or consent to something by the board that controls her teacher's license, and that is not something that she would be doing again. Would be to ever be able to work with kids again. So regardless of the amount of time she looks at, those collateral consequences sometimes are even worse and can last the rest of her life.
Because in some ways, you see, I feel like I could, and you're a defense attorney, on one hand, I'm not sure what her criminal record is, but she was someone who apparently played a big role in the community up until these allegations came forward. But then on the other hand, you don't want someone, if she's guilty of what she's being accused of, to be around kids and to be teaching kids. How do you see prosecutors typically take on these types of cases? I mean, is this one where you throw the book at someone because of the power that they had, or do you look at the role that she played in the community up until this point, where there's an argument to be made that I'm not making that argument, but I could see a defense attorney saying that she made a mistake?
Sure, and of course that's going to be the argument that I think the defense is going to have to make, both in a courtroom and to the prosecutor as they're trying to negotiate something. Is, anytime someone has a good character, has no criminal record, has is an upstanding member of the community, but for these charges they have, that's certainly something that you're going to play up and trying to negotiate it. Her bond, I think, was set at $45,000, which I
Yep.
don't think is a very high bond, and so that could also kind of indicate somewhat of what the prosecutor and the court felt about her to begin with, setting a bond so that she would end up being able to post the bond and be released out while this case goes on. But I think those are certainly arguments to be made, and I think those are probably good arguments to be made. The other part of it is, the alleged victim or victims in this case. The prosecutor will certainly be talking to those, either a child or children, depending on if it was multiple people or not. And, their feelings, their parents' feelings, what's going on is certainly going to play into how the case works out also, or how cooperative the alleged victim may be. Oftentimes if you're in a situation like this, I could see that the child may be very reluctant to testify, or, maybe in love, or maybe embarrassed, or, they don't want to be a part of this at all. Certainly something where there's been media attention or anything like that. So that could certainly play into the process of how the prosecutor ultimately makes some kind of a plea offer or the case is disposed of.
And then lastly for you, Josh, just as you were a prosecutor, you've seen these cases and you've seen the impact that cases like this can have on the victims. What have you seen in terms of what it takes for someone to recover from going through something like this? And even in a case now where this story is getting attention, at least locally in this small town in Alabama, and I'm sure for that young person or young people, we're not sure that will have an impact on them. What have you seen the path forward for these victims to be like after something like this allegedly happens?
In these types of situations, I guess my experience of seeing is that the victims have recovered, and that has not, at least from what I have been able to be a part of, has not, I guess, become a problem for the rest of their life. Like I said, I think the bigger issue oftentimes is either the child themselves or their parents. They do not want any attention. They don't want, it to follow the kid for the rest of their life, or, for rumors to play out in high school and college and whatever else. And obviously with social media, it's hard to get away from a lot of those things if someone's identity becomes known. But then you also have the other part where I've seen certain people where I don't want to say necessarily they're in love, but they are certainly in lust, or have serious feelings about the person who's their accuser, and they don't want anything bad to happen to them, or just the fact that person going away, I think is even more traumatic for them, because of their feelings, even if those are inappropriate feelings to be having to begin with. We see that both ways. But the biggest thing, I think, in these types of cases is the reluctance of victims to want to go forward, or want to, I guess, really punish, or really see serious consequences happen to whoever their accuser is. In my experience, a lot of times it's the family, the parents, that want more to happen, but then at the same time, you don't want any of the publicity. You want to keep their private matters private, and you certainly don't want that stuff following them. As opposed to, I guess, in Jess, you can kind of see like some Saturday Night Live skits or things like that where you have a teacher and an inappropriate relationship. But in my experience, it hasn't been like where it's a joke, but it has been something where we don't really want anything bad to happen to them. We just want to move on with our lives and put this behind us.
No, I mean, these are such complicated cases. I mean, certainly disturbing, and if you're a parent, incredibly disturbing, but at the same time, there's just so many layers to it. We'll see how this one plays out. Josh Corman, criminal defense attorney, thank you for joining us on Law and Crime as always.
Thanks for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.